Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to move on to the next session, which is the workshop that's been chaired by Eva Sharman from the DFE and Marunal. Thank you.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Hi, I'm Eva Sharma. I'm the head of the National Standards Unit at the Department for Education. And my team is responsible for putting in place the process through which we will develop the national standards. And this session is to hear from you and get your input to inform our policy thinking on the next steps on the national standards. And it builds from Marunal's session earlier. And I think a lot of that is really helpful context to what we're trying to do. So I'm just going to speak very briefly, mainly because the purpose of this hour and 15 minutes is really to hear from you, and then we're going to break into 5 different groups in the room and 1 group online. But I'll give a bit of context about what we're trying to achieve with the national standards. And I think I'll also talk a bit about some of the barriers, because I think it's important to be honest about what some of those barriers are, if we're going to have a conversation about how we make this a success, how we seize the moment, and how we sort of find that landing space to achieve something here. So in terms of the context, so we talked in the Green Paper about ending the postcode lottery in provision, and we said that we would introduce national standards. And I think it's important to sort of note that inconsistency is not a problem in and of itself. Things can be consistently bad, or you can have lots of different ways of achieving things that are good. And what we're not trying to do here is just make everything the same as an end goal in itself. But there are 3 aspects of inconsistency that do cause real problems. One is unfairness, the perception that, and reality, that you're not able to access support in some places, or it is harder in some places than it is in others. That is a problem. The other is inconsistency in outcomes. If some places and some areas of provision are able to achieve things and deliver results for children and young people that others aren't, then we have to ask the question why that is. And I think on the panel you heard a lot about good practice and good examples, but that not existing everywhere. And we're failing children if we have that inconsistency of outcomes. And the third is a lack of clarity if we have inconsistency of expectation, a lack of clarity of what you can expect and who you can go to for what. And so we want to, through the national standards, address those and create some clarity and set some clear expectations for what good looks like in the system. So in terms of what the national standards will look like, we are articulating national standards as clarity of what types of support should be available, whose job it is to make it available, and linked to whose job it is to make it available, which funding streams it should come from. And you'll see that that articulation is about the responsibilities in the system for provision. And I just want at this point to pick up the question that Marunal raised about individual needs. This is not about standardizing the experience from the perspective of the child. And we absolutely recognize that the support an individual child needs to receive needs to be based on an individual assessment of that child's needs. This is about standardizing the expectations and responsibilities in the system for system leaders about their role in providing that support, so that once we know what support a child needs, you know where you can expect to get it and whose job it is to put it in place. And that's the distinction we're trying to draw in this articulation. I also thought I would pick up the point about legislation. We are saying that our intention is to underpin the standards in legislation, and we'll be saying that in the improvement plan. We are talking here about something with a hard edge. There is a must here. You know, we're not still in the space of guidance and good practice and examples. We do think that there is a part of this problem where the solution is saying there are actually some musts here, and we want to enforce those. And we recognise the questions about accountability, and that is a part of our policy development going forward. How do we develop a set of statutory standards in legislation that we can enforce against? We said standards will cover education, health and care. Just to be clear, it will be education legislation, and we'll be operating within the existing statutory framework for the healthcare system. And you heard about that earlier in some of the changes that have happened in the health space. And that is one of our challenges, thinking about how we span different statutory frameworks while at the same time bringing that collaboration and shared responsibility for local delivery. As well as recognising that there are musts, we also recognise that that's not enough, and that if you're talking about quality of support, you're talking about a huge amount of professional judgment, varieties of methods, good practice, different approaches, and there is a space for shoulds, coulds, and bringing together the evidence and developing the evidence base where there are gaps. So we've said that alongside the national standards, we will be producing practice guides, which will be accompanying products to the national standards. So we want to span that spectrum of this is what must happen, these are really clear expectations, this is what should happen or could happen, based on experience and evidence, and where there is a variety of approaches. The standards themselves, we're clear that they should be condition neutral. This is not about, as Mrunal said, creating a taxonomy of different types of conditions and saying this is the right way to support a child with a certain need. It's about the provision that needs to be in place, and the leadership responsibilities for doing that. In the practice guides, that will be a bit more of a fluid space, and if we think that there is a gap to be filled in terms of professional understanding of what the evidence base is for supporting children, then we could fill that gap in the practice guide space where we're clear that that will be more discretionary. So that's how we're setting up the framework of what we're trying to do. And then, actually, sorry, there was one more point I was going to recognise here. Oh, yeah. I wanted to recognise the point about workforce that someone raised in the questions. And I think it's important, this is just about the national standards, but this sits in the wider context of the improvement plan. And I think it's really important to recognise that the national standards won't be a silver bullet. And actually, there's a lot we won't achieve just by writing something down and saying this is how the system should work. We won't, through the national standards, address waiting lists, for example. And we need to recognise the relationship between what we set out in the national standards and the workforce requirements to deliver those. And that's something we recognise in the improvement plan and will be a real challenge that we will need to think through as we develop this. So the national standards will need to sit in that wider context of policy development and thinking about what the issues are in the system. In terms of our next steps, so I said that my team is responsible for putting in place the process to develop the standards. We're not responsible for writing the standards. We don't have the expertise to do that. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to be putting in place the process through which we access that expertise. So through setting up how we engage with stakeholders, how we engage with parents and carers and children and young people, how we access expertise, for example, in academia, that we need to develop the standards. We will start by establishing a national standards steering group. And then we have said our kind of next milestone is that by the end of this year, we want to start testing some things with regional expert partnerships through the Change programme. And we know we won't get everything right straight away, but we want to set an ambition that sort of quite soon we start iterating and testing things through the local areas involved in the Change programme. We've said we'll publish a significant proportion of the national standards and 3 practice guides by the end of 2025. You'll see that we haven't said on this when we will legislate. We aren't saying we'll do that by the end of 2025. We're suggesting we would do that in the next Parliament, and we can't put a date on that. And we are saying that we will consult before any legislation. So there will be further consultation as part of development of the national standards, and we're clear about that. So that's what I was going to say in terms of the context for the parameters we're trying to sort of deliver with the national standards, and hopefully some of the principles we're applying. And then this is, I sort of want to recognise that's not very much. There's a lot of detail there that I haven't given, what the standards will look like, what the scope will be. That's not information we're keeping hidden. That's information we haven't worked out yet. this session is sort of where we are in the conversation. We're really at the beginning, and as well as understanding what you think the opportunity is here, a really big part of what we want to understand is where you think we should prioritise, because the scope is massive. It's intimidatingly massive. And at the same time, I recognise the comment earlier about pace and ambition. And so we've asked a set of questions, but I just wanted to sort of really emphasise that point about, of everything, our biggest question now is, where do we start? And your insight into that question will be really invaluable for us today. In terms of the way we've broken down the questions, we want to focus this session on mainstream provision. So we are trying to really clearly recognise the role of mainstream in the way we're articulating what we need to do on the standards. So we're starting with, in this session, thinking about the role of mainstream. And we've put some prompts on the board, so we're splitting into groups. But I also was kind of caught by that idea about how things have changed in 10 years that Mrunal mentioned earlier, and how the sort of expectation of that universal and targeted segment, and how your experience, and there were lots of nods in the room, that that's gone down over the last 10 years. So maybe a different way into the question, rather than in the abstract, well, as well as what do you think should be required as standard in mainstream provision, is what in your experience was provided as standard and now isn't, as an alternative framing for that question. So we're asking 4 different groups to think about 4 phases and what should be required as standard. Then we're asking one group to think about engagement with you specifically, and because we think that parent care engagement will run as a theme throughout the standards. So sort of what do you want the standards to reflect there? And then I think we're asking the online group, I can't remember which way around, but someone will clarify that in a minute. We're asking another group to think about barriers, because I think this isn't about kind of bashing settings. Like we're sort of asking from your perspective, and based on all your engagement with the settings that you talk to regularly, what do you think are the barriers, the wider contextual barriers that we will need to address and look at to get this right? And then, as I said, across all the groups, we are asking you to think about, okay, where should we start? Are there practical examples that you think this is a thing that this could solve for me, and I think it should be top of your list? So that's the session we want to run. I'll be coming around. There'll be members from the DFE in the different groups who will be taking notes, and also gathering up questions you have about the national standards that we need to think about in terms of when we articulate the next level of detail. So with that, I'll hand over to Mrunal to talk about how the logistics will work.
Thank you. Did everybody have a bite to eat at lunch? Right. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Right. We're going to get you to do some work now, okay? So you suckered into that one, all right? So we're going to divide this room up into 5 segments, okay? So I'm going to tell you what the segments are now. Broadly stay in your own segment, because I think everybody's got something to contribute to every single question, right? If you feel really passionately you want to be a part of a particular conversation, feel free to move, but I think everybody can answer these questions, okay? So let's start there. So what we're going to do is, the main question is, what should be required as standard within mainstream provision? That side of the room over there, led by Sarah and Sue. Sarah and Sue, can you just wave and identify yourselves? Where is... we've lost Sarah. Where's Sarah gone? Is Sarah outside? Oh, Sarah, yes. So, yeah. Yep, that side of the room is secondary. So Sarah's, as you can see, we're slick. So Sarah's going to move over to that side of the room, and that side of the room, that bit over there is going to be looking at secondary. Okay? We've got a middle section here, which is going to be led by Gillian Kate. Gillian Kate here. So maybe Kate, if you could just shuffle over this way a little bit, who are going to be looking at primary, answering that same question in primary. I'm going to ignore the middle bit of the room for a moment. I'm going to go over to the far end now. Early years. Your early years at the end, and Ruth and Jane are going to be running early years at the far end. Sort of this middle fifth here is going to be post-16 and colleges. And we've got Richard and Cindy. I'm looking for Richard and Cindy. Brilliant. So Richard and Cindy are going to run this section. And the middle bit here, right in front of me, are going to take the question, which is this one here. From the perspective, what do you think are the main barriers are to high standards of provision in mainstream? So think about barriers. What's going to stop us? This middle section here. And that's going to be led by Carol and Julie. I can see Julie. I haven't got Carol. Where's Carol? So Carol, move over this way. Right. Okay. So, and then the guys who are online are going to form a virtual group, and they're going to answer the question, which is, how and when should mainstream settings engage with you? So the co-production question. Okay. So that's the rooms organised, and the online group is going to be led by Roz, Richard, and Sarah Lee. So you have now got until I'm going to give you 25 minutes. I'll bring you back together here at 10 to. So get in your groups, answer the questions. Okay, guys, I'm going to bring you back now. What's lovely about these sessions is I get to sort of meander around, sort of eavesdropping a little bit on what you're saying. And what's been really interesting as ever is just the quality of the conversation. Like, there's so many themes being raised, such a diverse range of things being spoken about, such a range of issues, and such a lot of knowledge and expertise and passion in the room. So what I'm going to do now is we have a total of 6 groups. We have 5 in the room, 1 virtually. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the facilitators for each group and ask them to try and summarize the key points from their group in 3 minutes. Okay? Now, I completely appreciate the quality and the depth of what you've got written down on that paper cannot be summarized, cannot be brought, the richness can't be brought out in 3 minutes. That's why we're going to collect up the sheets. You've got Department for Education people on your table, you've got NNPCF people on your table, you've got contact people on your table, and we'll be capturing all of that and bringing it back. Now, let me just ask the folks from the DFE as well, did you enjoy your lunch? Because there's no such thing as a free lunch. And what I'd like from you, please, is could you give us something in the next week or 10 days that summarizes what you have taken from this session and what you are going to put into the development of the national standards from it? I'm looking to you, Eva, yeah? Brilliant, okay. So that's closing the feedback loop, okay? So we will do that. So we've got a commitment here to do that. So I'm going to go. We have a roving mic. We have 2 roving mics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start over in that corner with early years. So I'm looking to Ruth and Jane, I think it is, to feedback. So your 3 minutes start now. Go.
Thanks. I feel like I'm at scrutiny getting 3 minutes. Okay, so the first one we looked at was around policies, and we said that all policies need to reflect person-centred approach and be holistic, not just look at one element like attendance or behaviour. We also said that there needs to be a national criteria for social care eligibility and not to look at things through a safeguarding lens only, and talked about the lack of provision for short breaks for under 8-year-olds. Okay, next one. For training for staff, we talked about how we're seeing some good results from the Dingley's Promise training that's being offered, so we'd like to see that extended, and that staff should have training on how to work with parents right from the start, including how to work with a diverse range and culture Next one. So next one was about physical space, and we said that all settings across education, care and health, including leisure activities, need to be accessible with access to things such as changing places. And we also talked about the importance of having safe spaces and places and staff who are able to support young people to learn to self-regulate at a very early age. And then the last one were things that we felt needed to be available was SALT, speech and language therapy and occupational therapy, especially with sensory assessments, and it cannot be just a one-off process where they do an assessment and leave a report, but it needs to be a continual cycle. And the other thing that we talked about was having a common language and names for services, and services being available across areas. A lot of us find that if your school is in one area and you live in another area, you might not be able to access the same services. Hopefully that was 3 minutes.
Brilliant. Thank you. So Ruth has set a very high standard there. Thank you. Just pick out some of the themes now, and I think Eva, you're going to pick out some themes as well. What's really interesting is immediately right out of the traps, we're talking about education, health, and social care together, which is really interesting. Okay, next I'm going to go to Gillian Kate, because that is primary. Go over here. Your 3 minutes, go.
So we talked about the clarity of expectation in how schools communicate with parents. We talked about like a flow chart and accessible language. If you're worried, who do you go to? Who do you talk to? We talked about reasonable adjustments with policies, flexible systems and processes which allow schools to respond to individual needs, dialogue with parents to inform the policies, co-production to provide solutions to what is possible and what isn't. On the other table, we were talking about the skills, for teachers and the skill set of all staff to show that they can know and understand school policy, skill set in listening to parents, teaching skills in SEN placements, qualifications, SENCOs up to level 3 training, transition training, learning about communication, stop using TAs for SENCO's jobs. I'm going so fast now. We talked about accessibility in mainstream schools. We were talking about sensory-friendly spaces, dedicated outdoor learning spaces when we're talking about the physical environment, flexible support, stop me when my time runs out, ability to change lights, temperature, etc., putting the children at the heart with the child's choice, clutter-free environments, so many great stuff there that I can't say it all.
Brilliant. Okay, great. So fantastic. So let me just pick some of the things out there. So lots of stuff about skills there, which is really interesting. Again, stuff around co-production that you mentioned, and lots of stuff around it's really interesting in the primary is about the environment, getting the environment right, and for diverse children. Okay, great. Right. Next up, we're going to go to secondary schools, which I think was in that far corner there. So that's Sarah and Heather.
The bits that haven't been said already, we were talking about how policies need to be written through the lens of SEND, and how that was really important, particularly around attendance and behaviour policies, which also should include de-escalation. So there needs to be a lot of training around helping support teachers to de-escalate. There was lots of training around SENCOs as well, and how it is a whole school approach and not just for the SENCOs. And we also talked, because we're secondary focused, a lot around exams and how it's inconsistent on how SEN pupils are treated across exams, that the provision isn't put in early enough and children don't understand what they're going to be doing. And we also talked about whether or not forums could get more involved in participation with each SENCO in schools, and whether there could be some parent-led training for schools, but we need some extra funding, please.
Brilliant. Thank you. So again, it's really interesting. So policies rear their head, and that's something that I know is talked about a lot by parent carer forums, and sometimes the lack of reasonable adjustments in those policies, and that's being brought out. And I know that comes to bear really heavily, but when kids reach secondary school, you start talking about exams as well, and the role of SENCOs again coming up, the role of that contact person in mainstream schools is a big theme that's developing here. Okay, great. I'm going to then go to Richard and Cindy for this section here, which is going to be post-16 and colleges. Richard, is that you?
Post-16, yes. Well, a lot of it has been said, but also it's important that we, at post-16, we have to look at the build-up to get to post-16. So we're taking the transitions document that lead to what the children do in colleges. That is important. So that training has got to be there for the teachers and the staff for that to take place. We talked about... I've got to take my breath back. Okay. Transitions, that's part of what we're talking about, the documentation that supports the kids to go into post-16, provide social engagement. And I think here we talk about that, but it's also the fact that education, health, and social care have got to be involved in post-16 to support the children. Talking about the place and environment where the children go to school, that's got to be accessible, there's got to be local choice, there's got to be flexibility for the children themselves, and also the transport training, everything else. But also above all this, there's the idea of post-16, because they would have their voices. So teachers have got to be trained to understand, to talk to them, and give them their choices. And also, give us the chance as parents to enjoy our children taking their independence from us. With everything else that's been said by everybody else, that's just a top-up of that.
Brilliant, brilliant. So again, some of the themes there. What's really interesting there is that the post-16 and colleges group starts to pick up again on that, particularly really heavily on that engagement with social care and health again, really coming together for early years and for post-16. Transport. First time anybody's mentioned transport, and that is... very important. Again, we're talking about mainstream schools, so maybe not the special school transport that we're talking about, but the mainstream provision and the importance of children being and young people being mobile. And also, Richard mentioned that word independence. And if we have a moment at the end, I might digress and share an anecdote from a conversation I had yesterday about independence with some young people. Right. What I'm going to do now is go to the middle section, which was talking about barriers from the perspective of providers. What are the barriers that we need to think about when it comes to national standards that we have to overcome? And for that, I think it was Carol and Julie.
Okay, quite a few things have been covered, so I'm just going to quickly do this as quick as I can. Policies. We also had a discussion about how both national and individual school policies can be too rigid and they don't have enough reasonable adjustments in them, and that creates tension and problems, and that often the curriculum and academic expectations in settings can provide a barrier in either that they're too demanding or they're not demanding enough, depending on the needs of the child. In terms of skills and training, what we looked at is actually the costs to schools is a barrier of providing training packages, backfilling staff time, and particularly in support staff. Most support staff situations, we have to pay them overtime in order for them to do training. And the value that there would be in having training recognition for those staff, which it doesn't really happen now. Initial teacher training and support staff initial training, having some sort of minimum standard. At the moment, they start in the classroom with our children with no training. And also, one of the barriers is particularly amongst, particularly highly in secondary, is head teachers and the SLT not having much knowledge about SEND, and that in itself then causes decisions, etc., to be made. In terms of resources, one of the points was about there being a culture in certain service areas of seeing our children as a drain on resources and a cost, and sometimes lack of spending at an early stage means a lot more spending later on. And in physical environment, just picking out the need for safe spaces, both indoors and outdoors, and physical de-escalation spaces within mainstream settings.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you, Carol. So again, reasonable adjustments and policies, just making sure that the core policies around things like attendance and behaviour do make those reasonable adjustments coming out there. Some themes around money, training costs, about the perception that many SEND kids are a drain on resources, is the phrase you used, and that is a very real and live perception amongst schools, I think, so that's something we've got to overcome. And again, you loop back to some of the physical environment that we need to make sure that a lot of the schools, just the physical environment is just not right. For many of our kids, and you know, frankly, you know, I'm aware that this physical environment may not be right for everybody as well, and so apologies if you had to step outside because of that. You know, we do try. We can't get everything right, and not even we get it right. So I know that schools will struggle as well. So some really big themes there. Quite deliberately, I'm coming to the co-production question last, because that's the one we really care about the most, and that's the one that the online group was looking at, because we had 50-odd people in an online forum. So I'm looking at vigorous nodding there from Joe, brilliant. So I'm looking to Richard and Joe to feed back on behalf of our online participants.
Well, unfortunately, we got hit with a double whammy, because obviously we had the verbal chat and we also had the chat going on down the side. So we've decided to split this into an act of two halves. Joe's going to start off with the actual verbal feedback that we got, and then I'm going to follow up afterwards with the chat response.
Some stuff from the chat, but it will come through. Okay, so really, I think what was really clear was that parents and carers want to be communicated from right at the very beginning. Obviously, it needs to be the right conversation at the right time. We know that there's a lot of conversations that happen that aren't always the right conversations. It was really clear that sort of the early years was a key area, as that's when often developmental or delays or needs are identified. There needs to be some better support where COVID has changed. We're not interacting so much at play and stay groups. We're not going to see health visitors. We're not going into family hubs as much, so we're not having those interactions with others to maybe understand that our child might be developing differently to other children and young people. So it was the question of, well, how does a parent know what's normal and what might they need some support with? So they were talking about parents need greater understanding of who they can say and when they should say that they have a concern about their child and young person. We need to use the early years milestones much better, the early years checks, that should happen at the 2.5-year age. They need to be better training for professionals on how to respond to the information. Just because your child can tick a box because, you know, they can walk, they can sit up, they can use a knife and fork, doesn't always mean that there's not something else going on. Transitions was a key thing. There should be a lot more information to support parents around transitions, and not just from primary to secondary, but very much from those early years. Conversations about chats, we needed SEND hubs, parents needed peer-to-peer support, and we were talking about SEND support, and there was some suggestions that it would be really good to have some standardised templates around SEND support, so that parents are having the right conversations, the right people, the right information. And also there was a lot of talk about confusion with professionals saying that children need a diagnosis for support, so we're not having the right conversations there, and we're not engaging with parents and carers in the right way.
Right, so mine was on the obligation of schools to actively promote an inclusive, informed whole school community that involved the parents. Autism, neurological differences should be accepted in all schools as a standard, and those conversations shouldn't even need to be included. Earlier settings need to be overlapping with health visitors, and those conversations need to be having with parents included. Not just early years, at any point that a child struggles, parents should be included in those conversations. On a parent-carer forum side of things, the co-production with Senko forums and head teachers, so that the schools get an understanding of where the voices of parent carers in general are. There was a bit around the fact that professionals don't know the pathways, and that causes a block to involvement of parents. Communication, and that this seems to disappear the further up through education that children go, to the point that in secondary schools and colleges, engagement with children's schools is almost a minimum. Parents being labelled as helicopter parents so schools don't co-produce with them. And the wrong and or preconceived idea by professionals, that includes both education and health when it comes to the schools, to the parents' motives as to why they're chasing after things. Expert by experience needs to be embraced by education settings for parents, and I think that's it.
Brilliant. So a lot of really strong themes there. It's something that, obviously co-production is something we are very, very passionate about, and some of the key messages there around include parents early, communicate, early years, starts in early years, keep it going all the way through, and something I always say that co-production starts at the beginning and ends at the end. And so if you're starting a conversation with an agenda, it's probably not co-production, because you should be creating the agenda with parents, with families, with parent care reforms. I'm gonna so I see your hand up. I'm gonna keep us moving on for time, if I may. We're right on it, but your points will be captured. Hopefully, we can follow up. Before I hand back to Eva, what's really clear is that the passion, the knowledge, the hard work in the room is just shining through. And before we move on, take a moment and give yourselves a round of applause, because that was quite awesome.
Thank you. I'll be very quick so that we don't get behind time. And I said I would sum up key themes, but I've taken so many notes that I can't read anything on my page. So thank you so much for coming with us on the session and your engagement. I walked around the tables and I heard a lot. And I think the sort of overwhelming thing that was clear to me was sort of the combination of how wide this conversation is and the range of different things people were talking about, spanning everything from the sort of practical and tactical sort of things that are part of your everyday experience to the real fundamentals of how we train teachers and how we set up the system and what we expect of head teachers. And that is a massive conversation and a massive scope. And I think we're being ambitious here in the improvement plan about taking on that scope, but also alongside that, how much of what you were saying isn't rocket science and sort of could and should be the expectation that we set. So I think our job really is to go through that process of, okay, what can we do now? What do we already know from listening to you? Where can we start and have an impact, while at the same time recognizing that we need to prioritize and sequence because this is a really big question we're asking here. So thank you very much. And then the other thing is that obviously I think every group talked about communication, co-production, and that's what we expected, but it just really emphasised the extent to which we need to weave that through everything we do and everything we expect of the system. So thank you very much, and I will do what Rune asked, which is come back to you with a more nuanced reflection of what we've learnt from the session. Thank you.